Hello again, and we hope you had a good break and had a chance to check out the expo. Our next session has been put together in partnership with Icebreaker One. Icebreaker One is an independent global non-profit that works with private and public sector leaders to help them grasp the opportunity to transform the climate crisis into economic innovation. And we're exactly on the same page. It's a huge pleasure then to welcome Icebreaker One's founder, Gavin Starks. Gavin was formerly CEO of the Open Data Institute and the co-chair of the Open Banking Standard. Today, he's convened absolute leading experts from industry and policy to explore the topic of open energy. This session is called Delivering Net Zero, how better data sharing can help innovation in UK energy, and it promises to be absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear more. Gavin, are you there?
Indeed, yes. Thank you very much. Great. Well,
over to you, Gavin.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone who's watching. We hope to have a very exciting session this morning, and I'm going to keep it quite fast-paced as we go through. Just to go around as to who's joining us today, we have Dinker, who's the head of policy for BEIS on smart energy. We've got Rosie, who's senior program manager at Passive Systems. Stephen Steer, who's the head of data at Ofgem. Steve Field, who's the lead on distribution systems operation at Scottish Power. Sarah Merrick, who's the chief executive of Ripple Energy, and James Johnson, who's the chief executive of Picklo. I'm going to come back to an overview of open energy in just a moment, but I wanted to pass initially to Dinker to give us an overview from the BEIS perspective on the energy and industrial strategy, as unfortunately he has to leave us in about 20-25 minutes. But let's get kicking off straight away, and over to you, Dinker.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, I have to leave in 20 minutes. Sorry, everyone. As Gavin said, so I work at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy of the UK government. I specifically work in the smart energy team. And what we concern ourselves with in that team is how do we enable the integration of smart and flexible technologies to enable a net zero transition. And I think all of you will agree that data and digitalization are key to that integration, because technologies already exist, and it's about their at-scale deployment to the grid where open data becomes essential. And in my work in the last 2 years on this, it is quite clear that open data, like most concepts, does get misunderstood a lot. And while the technology exists for open data, I think there's a huge question around governance, which is policy and regulatory frameworks, which would allow everyone to embrace that idea more openly and with confidence. Because oftentimes there are issues about privacy, commercial interest, security, because we are dealing with critical national infrastructure that often come in the way of this debate. And I think there is a need now to expand our understanding of open data and make sure that we don't conflate openness with somehow reduced resilience, because that's not how we should look at it. So I think that's what we've focused on in the past few years. If you haven't yet, do take a look at the Energy Data Task Force report, which did a lot of extensive research with stakeholders and came up with a few recommendations for government, regulator, and industry on what they can do to make sure that we move towards this future of presumed open, as they like to call it. But I think, and as you will hear from the others in this panel, I think we are poised to take advantage of that, but this would require a lot of coordination, because we are aware that lots of people are doing some really interesting work in this. So it's really important that we coordinate, and hopefully the discussion today and the contacts that you will make today will help you make sense of this landscape. So I'll stop there now, Gavin, but please, if there's any follow-up questions, just let me know.
Will do. And just to touch on some of those points, one of the things we're trying to do here is build on another sector's success, and we're going to work out what is translatable here. But within the banking sector, we've seen this coming together of industry, the incumbents, the startups, the regulators around a framework called the Open Banking Standards. And that really helps to enable the market to share data with each other without putting all of the data into one place. It actually just says that everybody it copies the architecture of the web, keep the data at the edge, and then work out the rules of engagement. And as Dinka was highlighting there, helping people to understand the data rights, things like liability transfer, intellectual property, all of these commercial interests, which we've tended to do on a sort of one-to-one basis between companies, but not so much as a sector. So we're very keen today, and we've got a fantastic group of people here who can help us navigate through the many questions that there are about how do we go about building consensus. But I want to just pull out one theme here. It's really about collaboration. And we've really got to join the dots. As the UK, we have an absolute opportunity here to lead the world on building an open energy network. And I want to pass now on to Rosie to just get one or two key points from her perspective. Rosie.
Thanks, Gavin. I mean, I think what's really exciting is that we're at this pivoting point in the sector where we have the opportunity of net zero coming towards us, and we have the skills, the techniques, and the folk to make this happen. One really interesting theme that's coming out is the theme around engagement at a local level. So looking towards democratization of energy, heat, and transport. And what opening up energy data can do for that is effectively accelerate better localized decision making to help everybody have a better and more renewable future.
Super, thank you, Rosie. Now, as Dinka mentioned, and I strongly believe, the role of the regulator was really critical to this. So I want to come to Stephen Steer now, who's head of data at Ofgem. Stephen.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, and pleasure to be here. I think looking at it from the regulator's end, you've already alluded to some of the challenges that are upcoming. You talked about effectively the market design that you've experienced in the banking sector previously. Well, market design questions and shared infrastructure and such are not new challenges to the energy sector. It's the bread and butter of how the physical energy system has operated for well, a century. There's a new challenge arising for us, which is that as we seek to introduce new technologies into the energy system to decarbonize, the democratization, the federation of ownership is driving complexity that is therefore leading us to this need for digital and data to make it possible for people to make the right market decisions, whether it's day-to-day or whether it's strategic planning work. That brings with it some really fascinating and challenging issues for regulation, in particular things such as the nature of emerging new monopolies, what their natural size is versus the size that they may be today, and how their cadence into the future. So there's a whole raft of interesting questions about how you translate the really very agreeable top-level ambitions into a practical, deliverable, market-driven energy sector.
Great stuff. Thank you, Stephen. Now I'm going to flip straight into one of the energy networks themselves. So Steve Field, do you want to come in there on Scottish Power's perspective?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this area. It's really fascinating. I just want to take you back a little bit on my career path, because actually it's quite interesting to reflect on where we as an organisation have gone and how that kind of sets us up to be able to look at the challenges that are up and coming and try and play our part. As the previous speakers have all said, this isn't. We're just one part of a giant jigsaw here, and it's a really complicated jigsaw. And I want to maybe give you a little bit of a flavour for what that actually means. So you can tell from the colour of my hair, I've been around for a reasonable bit of time, and I've had just coming up for 25 years of working within Scottish Power, been involved in the deregulation, the opening up of the retail energy markets in 1998, and the opening up of the wholesale energy markets in 2001, 2003, the establishment of trading functions and a competitive energy retail business that didn't exist before these times. So we've seen transformation happening within our organisation, and we responded to challenges, and we are able to react and to play a role here. Even more recently, we have moved away from our carbon-based, our fossil-based fuel generation to help with the transition of the grid to a more low-carbon technology. So we don't now. We've shut down. I've seen the closing down of 2 coal plants in Scotland. I've stood on top of the chimneys of them before they were demolished and seen the views, and now they're gone or going and being completely demolished. So some big changes have happened, and actually during all of that time, and my experience of working within different parts of Scottish Power, the networks bit always seemed a bit boring, if I'm honest. It sort of was the bit that sat in the background and connected it all together. The people who worked in networks had been there for years and years and years, and they just did what they always did, and just let the energy flow, and it just kind of happened in the background. So when I joined the energy networks part of the business, quite interesting to see that actually there's some really big challenges here that we face. Stephen mentioned we've got a grid that we've operated for pretty much a century now. So you can imagine there's a lot of information sitting in forms that are not fully digitized. We do have a lot of digital records, but we've also got paper-based records for land rights that stretch back decades, and even the original drawings of the network still exist and have still got value to us. So we are looking at how we can make use of that sort of thing, and can we, for example, apply innovative techniques to extract more information from those manual records, paper-based records. And we've got manual processes as well. And again, there are efficiencies that we should drive out to kind of improve things like that. And we are doing that. We've got various different initiatives that we're looking at in this area. But as Dinka mentioned, the kind of key driver for us now is decarbonisation, and how do we play a role in trying to decarbonize to head towards net zero. And I thought it's just worthwhile doing a quick summary of what we're actually talking about here. So I mentioned we've done quite a lot on the grid.
Can I come back to you? Can I get you to come back to that?
Yeah, sure.
Do a quick introduction, and we'll come back to that exact question.
Sure.
I want to get to Sarah and then James, and then briefly come back to Dinka before he departs. Sarah, do you want to do a quick one or two kind of key items that you want to bring to the table today?
Yes, I want to bring the sort of startups perspective, and I think one of the great things about startup is that we don't have that sort of burden of legacy. So everything that we do, all of our systems are forward looking and built to be really future proof. So I mean, what Ripple does is we enable that democratization of energy by enabling people, consumers themselves, to own the wind farms and solar parks that are going to power their homes and then be supplied by that electricity. So the data surrounding the electricity is going to be really, really important. So although there'll be one source of the wind farm, we want to integrate smart tech so that we can consumers can start to schedule their EV chargers or their electric heating systems to make best use of the electricity from their wind farm. And I think from our perspective, in terms of what we need from the sort of industry level data, is just better layers of the data. So at the moment it's all the structure of the data is it assumes almost sort of vertically integrated utilities, or either generators or suppliers. Actually, there are lots of new companies in the market who don't fit those sort of boxes, and I think with the way we split up the data needs to be a lot more flexible and just able to cope with the far much more diversity of companies and roles that you get in the market now.
Super, thanks very much. And last but not least, James, do you want to come in and give us your one or two key perspectives here?
Hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me today. So we're a marketplace for trading energy flexibility. So we help distribution networks like SB Energy Networks to buy flexibility to manage bottlenecks on the grid caused by renewables and electric vehicles. So at our core, we're all about data exchange, data from the DNOs about what their needs are and how that can be shared with a wide audience, and equally data from all the providers of solutions and also what commercial parameters they're willing to enter these markets. From my perspective, the key sort of challenge and the thing that we're really trying to solve is about the user interface. How do we interface with all this data? How do we make sure it's high quality? How do we ensure it's robust? And some real key sort of practical considerations about this. So I think from my perspective, I'm keen to sort of discuss that layer of things as well today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, Dinka, before you have to shoot off, do you want to, I'd like you to pose, if we could address or unpack a few critical questions, or even solve the how we solve the problem in the next 60 minutes or so. What are the questions you really want to us to tackle today?
No, yeah, it'll be great if you can solve the problem in the next 60 minutes. I think that'll be fantastic. So yeah, I thought about that, and I have 3 questions I want to leave you guys with. So I think the first problem with data and digitalization is that the concept can often be quite abstract and make it difficult for people to sort of coalesce around. So I think it would be really useful if we could uncover or think about some really high value use cases that can become focal points or rallying cries for people to get around the agenda. So oftentimes we say, you just make data open and things will happen, which I believe in and I think is true. But I think having some sort of use cases would really help improve the communication around it. So have a think if you can. The other is around the role of incumbents. So not trying to put Steve on the spot here, but I think it's really important for us to discuss what role do the incumbents, who are by their own design monopolies, what role do they have? And I think rather than just giving abstract statements, giving some feedback on the efforts that they're already making would be really useful, because to give credit to the incumbents, I think they're making the right efforts, and it's important that they get early feedback on those efforts. So that would be really useful. And the third and final thing is probably from my selfish interest. What do you see as issues with policy and frameworks? So like GDPR is often touted as a barrier to open data. While my research does not reveal that GDPR is a barrier, it's actually a way in which you can process data so that it does not do harm. So it's not a barrier to open data. It just makes sure that we have the right rules to play with. So trying to understand what policy and regulatory barriers exist to open data would also be very useful. So I think those, and they are enough questions, I think, but if you can create some conversation around those, then I think that would be really useful.
Thank you very much. That's a really great framing. And I think I'd echo as well some of my own experience there in working through open banking, is trying to instrument that. GDPR takes things to a certain level, but actually using those use cases, and quite narrow use cases as well, to really help everybody in the sector understand what we're trying to achieve was critical. But let's come back to the kind of top level here. We were having a conversation just before we started on the scale of the challenge. And Stephen, you had some very good analogies, I thought, of how much energy we actually using in the UK, and can we translate that into more human relatable terms? Because that itself can feel quite abstract, I think.
Sure. Yes, I can do that. So I've kind of explained out some interesting points that Dinka raised, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to come back on those. So that'll be fantastic. I think one of the kind of, although Gavin, you're right, the kind of let's get some narrow use cases. There is this wider picture about decarbonisation, and how do we get there? How do we move? And actually, where is there at the end of the day? So I think we need to be able to understand what carbon footprints means, and what energy consumed means. And one of the things that I've been doing a little bit of poking around in my own mind about is how do I express that in ways that people could maybe understand. I'm a cyclist. I ride a mountain bike, so I'm watching the Tour de France at the moment. Everybody else is watching that, then you kind of know what a wattage figure for a cyclist would be. It's roughly 300 watts average-ish as a cyclist can put out, a good cyclist, professional cyclist. A car, when you run a car, it's about 100 kilowatts. So that's roughly twice the size of the Tour de France peloton required to operate a car. A standard wind turbine, they're roughly sort of average 3 megawatts, which is 10,000 cyclists. So you kind of, when you see these wind farms, wind turbines spinning on a hill, they look quite graceful and low energy, but actually they're not. They're pretty big energy figures. But actually, we also lose sight of the fact of how much are we consuming. So in transport terms, when you fuel your car at a petrol pump, the rate at which the pump is transferring chemical energy to your vehicle is roughly 16 megawatts. That's more than 50,000 cyclists and in effect you're holding in your hand, putting into your car for that minute or whatever it takes to fill your car up. And there's 40 million cars in the UK. So if you scale that all up, and I know this doesn't quite, it doesn't fit at all in terms of this is what you would actually do, but that's twice the world's population required to jump on a bike and generate 300 watts in order to fill all the cars in the UK up at the same time. Now, obviously, we don't do that. That's not actually what we're challenged to do. But using that knowledge and that information and recognizing that's the challenge that we've got to do, that's where I think data can help us, and we can be flexible. We can look at what our options are for when we charge electric vehicles up and react in a way that allows us to move a bit in that direction, because we've got a really big challenge ahead of us.
Great, thank you. So just to recap then, to power all the UK cars in the UK, we'd need twice the world's population to jump on a bike.
Yes.
Rosie, what about our domestic properties? What's the equivalent there in heating and in powering our homes?
Well, I think in terms of sort of the standard kind of way we look at it in the sector is when you have an EV charging at home, that's equivalent to an extra home on the network. So by having an EV charging at home, you're adding effectively an additional load of one extra home, and then that goes up and up when it comes to the electrification of heat. But what I don't want to do is start getting into that kind of EV-ageddon moment of, crikey O'Reilly, the network's going to have to be huge, because in reality, we already have the technology to manage this. So we already have smart charging that can do charging late at night or charging when we have lots of renewables. In terms of electrified heating, again, we have the mechanisms in place to effectively preheat buildings so that we're not actually overloading our network. So there's a huge amount of smart tech already out there, and really it's about how do we make sure that our local grids are able to utilize that technology in order to do kind of more with less.
And I think if I can just sort of so our UK's first consumer-owned wind farm, it's a 2.5 megawatt turbine, and that will be able to supply the electricity needs of 2,300 homes. So very broadly, it's around a megawatt of onshore wind would supply 1,000 homes, very, very roughly. That's quite a lot of onshore wind farms. Obviously, it's not all going to come from onshore wind, but if you then electrify heating and you electrify cars, you might bring that down to one turbine for 250 homes, or an offshore wind farm would be sort of 500 homes roughly. But it's not an insurmountable number of turbines, and I think obviously nobody's suggesting that it's all done with wind alone. But yeah, as Rosie said, it's about enabling smart tech to be able to essentially sort of match consumption with that generation as best as possible to sort of minimise the impact on the grid.
Great, James, do you want to come in as well, the sort of size of the challenge you're seeing here, and what sort of use cases do you think that data can help unlock in the development of our open energy systems?
Well, I think the key thing that data can unlock is being agnostic to what the solutions to the problems are, instead of being very prescriptive about, okay, we have a problem on a part of the network, or a forecast problem because so many people are buying electric vehicles. They can essentially turn that upside down and say, we've got an opportunity here for a market solution to solve that in a more efficient way than reinforcement. And data enables you to be agnostic and allow the most efficient, cost-effective, innovative technology to come to the fore. So data is very much an enabler, and it goes hand in glove with the concept of open markets and competition and enabling new technologies to come to the fore. But I think that then, again, it lies the responsibility on policy and regulation to make sure that the rules of the game are also lined up so that can be sort of a fair marketplace as well as everything else. So it's data is part of the picture, and making sure that we have high quality in open data sets is part of the picture, but it's part of a wider set of things that we need to get right.
Super. And Stephen, what do you then see? What are the high value use cases from Ofgem's perspective?
Oh, well, I mean, so yeah, it's very tempting to turn to things such as flexibility markets, but this is a very broad term. And so I think if the building blocks around that are naturally the integration across markets, transport and energy together, the opportunities for flexibility between heat and electricity. And when I say transport as well, I wouldn't just lock your thinking into ground-based electric vehicles. That the direction of the travel of the aeronautical industry, albeit COVID's probably disrupted things rather significantly, is also has electrification in mind, and that's maybe not in the forefront of everybody's minds when working. So at the high level, what you start to see is this merging of sectors, which is a really high value and important and relevant issue from a policy perspective of how do we make sure that the overarching design that we take to what is increasingly becoming an ecosystem rather than a collection of siloed systems starts to become very relevant from a regulatory point of view. And I say that regulatory, not an Ofgem point of view, because that will naturally blur the boundaries. So that's the kind of high level side of things. I think a theme that very regularly comes up if we start creating a little bit of reality around it has to do with matters such as the low voltage network, where that's probably a topic more than probably most others, where I hear cries for insight and information about the status of the granular detail of our networks. And certainly if you're thinking about flexibility tradings and so forth, then people need to know where their local constraints are. So that gives you a sample of a local topic. But let's not forget one of the flip sides to markets and efficiency is also protecting of consumers, and you've got to think very carefully about distributional impacts. Think about the people who are more or less digitally engaged and how that they may need very different solutions to one another to make sure they get the energy market they want. So whilst I appreciate that it's very tempting to think about systems and overarching efficiency, there's a danger in looking at averages alone.
Great. And what's the potential here? So I've maybe come to Sarah here. Like, can we get asset level data here? Can we get that granular level data? What are the blockers to unlocking those kind of use cases?
Yeah, I think it's with the large scale assets, it's easy to get the data because there's only one data source. That a wind farm will have one level of generation. Obviously it varies, but it's one number that varies. So it's very easy, potentially very easy to get that out, obviously aggregated up. It's far more difficult to get the flip side of that, which is all of the consumption level data. So getting once everyone's got smart meters, to be able to get that aggregated consumption level data aggregated would be really, really useful. But yeah, I think from a from a large scale generation, it is, because you've got a relatively small number, certainly compared to individual household consumers, you've got a relatively small number of data points. That massively helps in terms of being able to get that data and aggregate it.
I think, Gavin, can I just come in here in terms of coming to I think Stephen's point around customers and protecting future customers' interests, and what's going to be really, I think, important as we kind of move forward is that local authorities are able to get the access they need to carry out deep retrofit to enable energy efficiency upgrades, but also the installation of distributed generation in the home. And what I'd love to see is more availability of that low voltage system data to think about capacity planning and to enable more proactive action by local authorities. And then more broadly, from a sort of policy perspective, it would be great if we could remove the barriers to local energy supply. So if we could get that local electricity supply bill through Parliament, that would enable that local matching of supply and demand that would revolutionize community energy and would really open up the ability for people to have more choice and say in their energy future.
Excellent. And Steve, what are the barriers to helping that happen, do you think, from an incumbent's perspective?
There aren't particular barriers. There's a lot of challenges. I mentioned that we're operating assets that could have been in place for decades. The information that we've got about those assets is varied, and it's not just us saying that. The other network companies that I speak to are also in a mixed situation. So we kind of need to get the basics right to start off with. We definitely want to make sure that we've got digital records and information about our assets. We are. I mean, I'm in the fortunate position as I'm an IT professional working within Scottish Power Energy Network. So this is a fantastic opportunity for me to play a part in this bigger picture. And I think everybody's made the point that actually this isn't something which the incumbents can do, by ourselves. We've got to work alongside other people, and that presents some fantastic IT opportunities to make sure that we digitize processes, make sure that we've got data where we can get it, capture it, record it, make it available to people, do our own analysis on it, provide our own mechanisms to be able to combine our information with transport information or heat information or whatever else it is that's relevant, model things and make decisions on the back end of that using data as the key sort of driver, so that everything we do is evidence based and we're able to monitor it and demonstrate that we're moving in the right direction. And we're moving in the right direction alongside other people, and we're working in a collaborative way with other organizations. So as I say, as an IT professional, it's an absolutely brilliant opportunity, and there's some really interesting challenges. And we don't know all the answers. And I suppose that's maybe one of the things I would say is that I don't think anybody's got all the answers. Dinka posed some really interesting questions, and we can speculate about how we take them forward, and we'll get some things right in doing that and some things wrong. We need the ability to be able to react and be agile and respond and fail fast, if you like, and find our way forward in the most efficient way for all of us and involved in this activity.
Super. I think let me just reflect a little bit there on some of the things that we learned through the development of open banking, because what you just touched on about bringing people together. For those who don't know, the open banking standard is overseen by an independent nonprofit and acts on behalf of industry and acts as the interface with the regulator, in that case, the Financial Conduct Authority. What they've done there and what they've achieved is a common and shared way of data sharing. And the most important thing from my perspective is that they've agreed not just the technology, but the rules. They've agreed the rules for data sharing, liability transfer, and so on. And they've started and made things work. So that last point on moving quickly and not necessarily trying to solve all the problems before you start. I think if we tried to address all of those problems before we started, we'd still be sitting here scratching our heads. In taking things out to market, and it took about 3 years, but it's now 100% penetration in the whole of the banking sector in the UK, and there's about 300 or 400 fintech companies also plugged into the same system. So we have got a cohesive and interoperable financial system. And thinking about how we do that with somebody's business's bank statements or customers' bank statements is quite a narrow use case. Here we've got a huge number of actors in the energy supply chain. We've mapped out over 8,000 companies who are active in the energy supply chain in the UK. So what are the challenges? Maybe if I come back to James and then to Rosie, what are the challenges for data sharing here, and how can we bring people together around this? And startups are doing a huge amount to drive things forward? What would help remove blockers from your perspective?
I think, first of all, there is quite a variety, there's quite a range of data quality and understanding and ability to deal with different types of data sets in the sector. I wouldn't say there's a common level of understanding about what an API is, for example, or the value, or how to design a good one. Most data sets that we've come across somehow or another involve spreadsheets, and that is probably the sort of baseline standard for data sharing across a lot of the energy sector. So I think there's a kind of a big educational piece and learning curve for the sector as a whole, if we're to open up data sets in an efficient way via APIs and to do more radical things like give everything in the energy sector an IP address. All these sort of really cool ideas. I think there's a journey that the sector on the whole has to go through, and I think there's a key question about who's driving that and who's helping educate and develop the understanding of the sector. Open question, I guess.
Excellent. Rosie, I'll bring you in there too.
I mean, I think what I'd like to be very positive about is the Ofgem innovation link that's really given, smaller companies the chance to get some really targeted help and support from the regulator to test out, new ideas. And that's something that is really fantastic. And I think is, something that I'm really happy is going forward. If we think about sort of the energy regulatory framework in the UK, I think we have over 13 industry contracts now. The process for entering the market is incredibly complicated, and it's challenging for kind of smaller, more agile companies who just want to operate in one area, say to be a local electricity supplier. That's just not possible at the minute. It's not possible to, just operate for one geographical reason, although there is a consultation out on that as we speak. And I would love to see a more sort of, I think, services-focused regulatory framework that allows customer, the customer is, we often talk about the customer being at the heart of everything we do, but when you have to wade through over 14,000 pages of regulatory text to get there, that's quite a long journey. So I would love there to be a bit of a refresh in our regulatory system. I would love there to be a more agile approach, but also not losing sight of looking after those customers who aren't particularly actively engaged in the sector. So always being careful around how we take forward innovations to make sure we don't leave anybody behind.
Excellent. So Dinka mentioned as well on this idea of presumed open. Now, the process there, to my understanding, is that we want to try and push more data into the open sphere. And obviously, having run the Open Data Institute, we're very keen to see data should be made available where possible. At Icebreaker One, we've got a slight nuance on that, both in terms of positioning and language, where we talk about preemptive licensing of data. And I just wonder here, Rosie, again, just to that point, one of the things that open banking enables is if you sign up as a small company into the open banking standard, you effectively agree to the terms and conditions and processes there for the development of and access to data, so you can put your information available to what is effectively a closed ecosystem, which is regulated. Do you see that same potential here within the energy sector, and what's different?
Absolutely, and in a way, nothing's different, because in terms of sort of energy data, it's less personal than your banking data, but we've done it in banking. So I think the fact that we've been able to move forward with, I think, over 7,000 companies are signed up to the open banking standard is a bit of a stellar example of what can happen if you have the right level of consensus, collegiality, and a clear direction of travel and a vision. And I think that actually we are at that pivoting point in the energy, heat and transport sector where we have to move this forward. We can't kind of effectively try and retrofit things into existing systems. We need to move to a more agile way of working. And I'm really excited to be part of this journey in terms of working out how we can help the incumbents and the smaller companies work together to effectively, reorganize and transform this really amazing sector to be working in.
Thanks. And Steve, obviously the open banking kind of more literally translates with energy bill information or smart meter data. Doesn't necessarily translate to asset level information or to detailed, that sort of granular data flow that Stephen was mentioning. What do you see as the blockers? I know you're working on the technology side, but how do you see this sort of shift in Scottish Power as an organisation? You know, what happens when this hits the legal teams and the business teams and the sales teams and so on? What do we need to be aware of there?
Yeah, I think I have some experience, actually, direct experience of this, in that helped to pull together a demonstrator for what a digital system map could look like for a specific small example of bringing together generation capacity, the capacity to connect generation to the distribution network in Scotland. And that's two sets of data that are already published separately by Scottish Power and by Scottish and Southern on our website, open data. I thought, actually, here's a good demonstrator. Let's bring those two data sets together and prove what we could do if we created an all Scotland generation availability. It's called a heat map. So we started the conversations and quite quickly got into the point that the legal teams raised, that, well, yeah, that data's published openly just now, but it's published for a particular purpose, and what you're asking is a different purpose. So does the framework within which the data is currently published allow us to do something else with that data? And that's an exact prime example of presumed no or presumed closed and move towards open when you challenge that. And I think we've got to turn that on its head. We need, as an organization, to protect the data that we need to protect. We've got to protect customers' interests and data privacy. We've got critical national infrastructure assets that we need to protect from a security perspective. So we need to bear that into account, take that into account. But we need to start from the process of, well, the data should be open, and if there's a reason to protect it and not make it open, then that's the approach that we take. So it's a mind shift change that's a challenge for us at the moment.
So there's a culture change to enable data to be shared more effectively. And I think just to recap, the Open Data Institute, we defined open data as data that can be used by anyone for any purpose for free. And so that immediately gets a lot of business people running for the hills when you talk about open data. Yeah. But there's other examples here of how can we collectively improve industries. There's one anecdote from the wind turbine sector, which I heard, where the different manufacturers, and Sarah, maybe you can come in here as well, started to share engineering information about their performance, about what was working and what was not working. And I believe that was quite a painful process for everyone involved, because the starting point was everyone saying our data is not very good, or it tells a bad story, or it's stuff that we don't really want to share because, reasons. But what's been your experience there, Sarah, on how much collaboration could we really reasonably expect? And if we did sort out the right framework for data sharing, where people felt that they could share what might be seen as commercially sensitive information, what would that achieve? Would it accelerate innovation, or would it just lead to more competition?
Yes, and I used to be on the board of Renewable UK, which is the trade association for the wind sector, and I think I think everyone recognises the benefit of collaboration. I think part of the, in terms of there was lots of work that went on about sharing sort of health and safety information and sort of information on incidents very, very quickly with the other health and safety professionals in the various other companies, and I think that worked very, very well. I think in terms of operational data, it's sort of, if everyone does it and it's sort of universal, then I think it can work really, really well. I think the issue is if there are certain companies that say, okay, I'm not going to take part in that, you then sort of get a sort of selection bias, I think, in terms of the data sharing. So I mean, obviously it's very difficult to sort of mandate involvement in things like that when it is commercial information, but when it's sort of generic industry information, I think it's a lot easier, and you don't have to have that sort of individual opt-in, which obviously you would need if it was commercial data. So I think everyone in the industry completely recognizes the benefit of collaboration, but the issue is just when you get some companies that don't want to collaborate. I think that can then make it more difficult for the others as well. But certainly on the health and safety side, it's worked really well.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to come to Stephen at Ofgem in a moment, because clearly the getting people to lean in is something that a regulator can very much help with, and the regulator within the Competition and Market Authority helped the banks lean in. Again, another anecdote from my days with the Open Data Institute was everybody was really happy for open data to exist as long as it was everybody else opening up their data so that they could get the benefit from it and get the market advantage. So I think here, looking at the implementations of open banking around the world, and there's over 20 countries now in development, some territories have taken forward that standard in a voluntary way, but as a market-led way rather than the regulatory-driven way. New Zealand, for example, and they've managed to get maybe 80 or 90% of the market involved, but they're now asking for regulation to make sure it's 100% market adoption. So one of Dinka's questions then, Stephen, was, what do we see as issues with policy and frameworks? What can Ofgem do, or what does Ofgem need in order to help fuel all of this and oil the gears in the system?
Thank you. Yeah, there's lots of stuff I could say around that. So we certainly do need everybody to be pitching in. It actually, before I get to that, I'd like to just skim over something you've been saying earlier, because I think there is an important distinction between the banking sector and the energy sector, which relates to a lot of the conversations you've had over the last few minutes. And the crux of it is not about data particularly. It's there are assets which in the banking sector are fundamentally private assets, whether it's the individual and their banking data, or whether it's private institutions, etc., etc. Whereas in the energy sector, there are assets for the sector that are collectively funded by society, in this case, energy consumers. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need different frameworks and so on. You can still use the same decision-making processes, but it might change some of your decisions. And what that implies is that at its heart, I think rather than going to think about data, just abstract backwards, and actually, I think a nice, much more mature end of society is around looking at our physical landscape. The UK has a lot of physical assets, and among which are national parks. And we have things like the right to roam in place, and I think that's a much more mature area that we could all learn from, about how do we deal with shared societal assets where we have the right to roam through them, and that should apply to our data as much as it does to our physical assets. But that starts to tell you things about what we need, and it tells you fundamentally this is a shared issue. You need everybody participating. The regulator needs to know what level of detail do people actually require from us to strike the right balance between regulating those natural monopolies around shared assets versus where markets can pick things up, where things transition to becoming a private interest. If we bring it back to home for a moment, I like to challenge people of the difference between a data service and an analytical service, because oftentimes the data is monopolistic in its source, but providing insight and information and enriching that data can often be delivered by markets. And that is a prime case of where we are judging when does the regulator need to participate and make sure that information is available so that markets can succeed, versus under or oversizing the monopolistic service, which means you either prevent markets from happening in the first instance, or you oversize someone's monopolistic privileges and you underperform the delivery of the services. So we have a whole raft of work taking place on these themes right now. Just like everything else in this space, we're iterating. We need to keep getting regular feedback about the level of detail that we should be going to. We're starting with principles-based regulation, and we're learning when we need to go further. And we can only know how far to go by hearing from all of yourselves.
Great, that's fantastic. So we're approaching the end of the session, and I think I'd echo everything there that Stephen just outlined in trying to break up effectively the data supply chain so that we can get as many different actors looking at these different parts of the problem independently. My final question is, I'm going to go around the room here, starting with Rosie. If you could wave a magic wand here, it could be a bill through Parliament, it could be industry coming together and sharing everything. What would be your one thing? What would be your one ask?
So I'd like the local electricity supply bill to be passed through Parliament very, very quickly in order to unlock access to renewable energy for all.
Brilliant. Steve?
I'm going to cheat a little bit, Gavin, if you don't mind. I'm going to use my magic wand to summon up a genie who'll give me 3 wishes. So the first one is that I want to transform our accountants to environmentalists. So we've got teams of people who look after our ledger, our margins, our settlements process, our procurement processes. They go through umpteen years of training and to put some initials after their name, and they apply a discipline to the management of money that I think we should start to look at for carbon. If we had carbon brought into the equation in our decision making, then I think that would make things a lot easier to understand where we are and where we're going in the journey towards net zero. My second bit then would be that that's not just us doing that actually all organizations are starting to do, and we're in the data that allows everybody to make decisions across the piece that are in the best interests of moving us towards net zero. And the last wish would then be that I want an electronic mountain bike so I can go and ride up a mountain and look down in satisfaction at the work that's been created from all that.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. James?
I'm going to take a sort of technologist viewpoint here. How about giving everything an IP address, unlocking the sort of hopefully shared vision of an energy web of data, and all the outcomes from that.
Wonderful. Sarah?
Yeah, I think I would get all the data to be, as well as being open, just to be able to be layered and so that the structures of the data reflect the increasing diversity of the structure of the industry. So it's not just generator data or supplier data or network data. It's a lot easier to work across the various different silos, which is increasingly happening, but the data needs to reflect that as well.
Excellent. And then last word from Stephen again.
So I'm going to push for a utterly strong service culture, whether you're working in a monopolistic environment or a competitive environment. You need to know who you are there to serve and what exactly you're going to do to solve their problems, and do that with a nice outward-looking focus of how can I make the most of things, rather than looking inwards and saying how can I solve a specific problem. Go and ask people what their problems are. Don't presume to know it.
Wonderful. That's perfect. So we'll feed back to Dinker that we've basically solved all of the questions that he set us out at the beginning of this session. I'd like to just close out now by thanking Dinker, Rosie, Stephen, Steve, Sarah, and James, and I will now pass back to Charlie.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you to the whole panel. What a brilliant initiative. We wish you well with it, and we'll be following the news with interest. It sounds like there's a massive opportunity there, not just for the planet, but for entrepreneurs as well. Gavin and the panel will be doing a Q&A session at 11, which is in just 5 minutes. And if you've got a gold pass, you can just click straight through right now and send them your questions. And if you don't have a gold pass, you can go to the cogex.co website and sign up one for free, as there's a free trial till the end of September. So that's all from me now. Do join us back here at 12 noon when we're turning our attention to food and farming with the director of the UK's National Food Strategy. Bye for now.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogex.co.